Chapter 2. Strategy, Attack and Defense. Even when we are only armed with a few simple movements from the larger repertoire of the Walpurgis manuscript, we are faced with a number of decisions about how to implement and sequence these movements to achieve the best outcome. Is it better to step into distance quickly and launch an attack from our right shoulder position? Is it better to wait in a contraria, like Hauptschritt, and then aim to bind our opponent's sword when he or she enters, and then finish with a Schildschlag or a Nüschen? The manuscript emphasizes attack. By entering first, we gain a small time advantage, as we know what we are about to do while our opponent has to watch and react. By attacking first, we often force our opponent to abandon a useful custodia, from which they may be able to launch an attack, and move to a contraria to contain our attacking action. The manuscript repeatedly suggests that victory was won in a bout by the one who entered first. By attacking first, one can also gain an opportunity to get a quick kill from an opponent who is not quite ready and is slow to begin. The authors of the manuscript scatter throughout the text examples of fights in which the priest or the scholar hesitates and fails to bind or move quickly and is rapidly dispatched, usually with a Stichlag. To quote from the manuscript and the translation, "Here the student failed to bind. The priest at once entered, and not unrightly, since wherever the one in guard omits what he ought to do, the opposer should enter at once, as happens here." Clearly, if both combatants are attempting to attack first, one, or perhaps both, will not succeed. Also, if you wish to gain the advantage of the first attack, then it is no use being too predictable. If your opponent can see what attack you are undertaking, they can prepare a defense and counterattack before you have fully entered and defeat or even reverse the advantage. As only a limited range of attacks can be launched efficiently from most custodia, it is important when you are outside distance not to too clearly signal your intent. Lingering in a custodia for a time before entering provides many advantages to your opponent. For example, let us consider the second custodia we discussed in the first chapter. What efficient attacks can we launch from this position? In reality, this custodia is an excellent position from which to bind an incoming opponent's blade, particularly if the opponent cuts from above. However, this custodia's attacking options appear to be limited largely to cuts from above to the right side of the body, or the opponent's buckler arm or sword arm, or perhaps to enter with a Stichlag. Therefore, once an attacker takes up second custodia, their opponent has a good idea of the range of actions potentially available to them, and can proceed to a contraria that will successfully block these potential actions. As a result, simple cuts or thrusts are unlikely to be successful unless your opponent is slow to begin. Attacking from the second custodia. The manuscript suggests two attacking strategies from second custodia. Neither of these is a simple cut or thrust. They are the Durchtreten and cutting between the sword and buckler. The Durchtreten, stepping through. If a long step into distance is taken, either directly or slightly to the side, then the extended arms of the attacker can reach around the opponent's sword and buckler, attacking the right or left side, including the sword or buckler arm, and the body and head. This action is referred to as the Durchtreten, or stepping through. This very aggressive push forward behind our defensive cone, directly or slightly to the side, into the opponent's defense, is mentioned several times in the manuscript. It works best when not expected, or the opponent is slow or reluctant to move. If your opponent becomes aware of the likelihood of a stepping through, then they can move off the line and cut you as you enter, or perhaps wrestle. The manuscript author suggests the stepping through to the right, to the buckler side, is more effective than to the left. Cutting between sword and buckler. A second technique is to cut between the opponent's sword and buckler, attempting to force a way between them. While the manuscript admits this possibility, it warns that it is very easy for the opponent to avoid the attack with a slight movement of their arms, so the cut falls upon the buckler, opening the attacker to an easy thrust counterattack. Nonetheless, this way of trying to penetrate the opponent's defensive combination of sword and buckler is discussed several times in the manuscript, suggesting that it was widely encountered in the Walpurgis tradition. There is also one example in the manuscript of moving directly from the overbind on the right to the cutting between the sword and buckler, as an alternative to the Schildschlag and the Nushin. The range of attacking options from Custodia 2 is limited, as they are for all Custodia, and your opponent is generally well aware of these possibilities and possibly your common preferences. Continue to attack with a simple cut from the second Custodia and you will repeatedly be successfully counterattacked, often with Stichschlag. One way to enhance the likelihood of your cutting attack will succeed is not to adopt the relevant Custodia until just before the attack is launched. Well, this is really starting to sound like Fabris now, right? Walpurgis Custodia have been designed to allow flow from most forms into most others efficiently and quickly. However, frequent shifting from one Custodia to another is also ill-advised. A smart opponent will attack during the transition from one Custodia to another, catching you in an awkward and unprepared stance. The moral of this extended consideration is that you should quickly take up a Custodia and immediately launch into an appropriate attack. Do not linger in a Custodia. Do not always use the same one or two Custodia so that your attacks are very predictable. If your opponent attacks simultaneously, then move to bind his or her blade. From a right overbind, expect a Stichschlag and a Nushin. There are other moves from the second Custodia which we might be able to use which are not mentioned specifically by the manuscript. One option is to move to the Stichschlag. The Stichschlag would make an excellent quick attack against a hesitant opponent, and the move from second Custodia is not too slow or difficult. While the manuscript recommends entering before your opponent, it frequently makes use of binds to neutralize your opponent's attacks, which can then lead to attacks of your own. We have mentioned the potential for overbinds from the left, from Custodia 2. Though the manuscript recommends overbinds whenever possible, underbinds can also have significant potential and are important to the Walpurgis style. I find you can fairly quickly rotate your blade from the second Custodia to the underbinds on the right and left. These can be particularly useful when responding to a rapid thrust. So far, we have only met one Contraria, Halbschlot. While this Contraria works well to protect you from most attacks, the manuscript recommends a particular Contraria to counter second Custodia. The manuscript does not name this Contraria. I will follow Wagner and Hand's very sensible terminology and call it right cover. Right cover, a Contraria designed to meet Custodia 2. When our opponent stands in Custodia 2, we have a reasonable idea of where they can efficiently launch an attack. The simplest attack is a cut to the left side of your body, usually to the head, the left arm or left shoulder. As we noted earlier, this type of cutting attack is not the manuscript's preferred option from this Custodia. It is too easily overbound and unlikely to succeed. This conclusion is based on the assumption that our opponent is displaying good form and keeping his sword and buckler firmly together. However, a simple mistake from your opponent, who opens a gap between their sword and buckler, can make this simple cutting attack quite effective. Similarly, an aggressive fencer who starts with a simple but firm cut to your left side from Custodia 2 can be quite happy to meet your buckler. He can bounce his sword off the buckler and return rapidly at different angles as he closes, forcing you to retreat. This rain of blows can be effective in keeping the attacker safe, as you are so busy deflecting their blows that you have little time to think of a counterattack. If you allow yourself to be driven like this, you will lose the bout eventually. You need a better way to stall your aggressive fencers' approach so that the attacker's sword can be bound efficiently from the first blow. Meeting their cut with the buckler will not do this. We need right cover, the contraria recommended by the manuscript to counter Custodia 2. Right cover involves standing in much the same fashion as a half shield, except the arms are crossed at the wrists. The sword arm must be on top of the buckler arm. Our sword hand and arm is out of the way from the attack from Custodia 2, so keeping the buckler to the left is not necessary. Now when your attacker strikes to your left, he does not bounce off your buckler but strikes your sword, allowing you to immediately lean on their sword, generating an overbind on the left. If you can't apply enough pressure to get a good overbind, you could step forward with full extension, and then stepping through cutting at your opponent's body, or perhaps thrust through the midline at their head or body. You have turned a firm, aggressive attack, which could have led to a series of blows, into a position where your opponent is constrained and on the defensive. Right cover also has the advantage that the sword on the left covers the head more efficiently than the buckler. As a result, a rapid change of direction of your opponent's sword on entry is not as likely to pass your defensive stance. The manuscript offers this advice when the priest in second Custodia sets to the student who is in right cover. He who first adopted the opposition can do three things. First, he can press the sword down and then step through. Second, he can deliver a blow on the right side. Third, he can deliver a blow on the left side. Note that his adversary can do the same thing even though the one who adopted the opposition is the first one ready for it. The manuscript also depicts right cover as protection against the rising cut of the Nushin. To again quote from the translation of the manuscript, "Just previously the student delivered a blow, striking the priest's head. Here the priest prevents this, because he executes the counter as illustrated." The illustrated counter is, of course, right cover. The priest also demonstrates that when he attempts the overbind on the left, it is possible for his opponent to move around the bind in a clockwise disengage and sticklach at the head. Whenever you attempt a low bind, whether an over or underbind, and you are leaning strongly forward, the head can become a target for a thrust or a shield strike. You must rapidly move to the next action after the bind. By offering a threat to your opponent, you can decrease your vulnerability and also decrease your opponent's options. Attacking from third Custodia. Only a limited number of fights commencing with the third Custodia are provided in the manuscript. The only specific attack mentioned is a thrust through Langort at the opponent's face when he is slow to commence. You might expect that the primary aim of this Custodia is to provide the potential to overbind the opponent's sword on the right. Again, we might speculate that a shield strike from Custodia 3 is possible and could be effective. There is no mention in the manual of using a shield strike from Custodia 3, presumably because the sword arm is likely to be on top for a move from Custodia 3, while it is underneath for the shield strike. Despite this difficulty, I would recommend exploring the possibility of landing a shield strike from the third Custodia when the circumstances warrant. A move to the underbind on the left can also be useful, but it is awkward from this Custodia. An underbind on the right is probably a more effective move. As with other Custodia, simple cuts from Custodia 3 are unlikely to be successful, unless your opponent is slow to start. It is possible to imagine cutting at an opponent's sword arm, but this is only likely to provide your opponent with an overbind on the right. Left cover, a contraria designed to meet Custodia 3. The contraria recommended in the Walpurgis manuscript for the third Custodia might reasonably be called the left cover. The sword and buckler are held high in front of the face, but the wrists are crossed so that the sword is pointing downward on the left, and the buckler is facing to the right with the sword wrist on top. Close examination of the illustrations of left cover suggests that the buckler hand may have the thumb side of the fist holding the buckler pointing down, that is, the buckler may be inverted. This different grip is slightly more comfortable to maintain, but otherwise the difference appears functionally of minimal significance. We should not be surprised to learn that the manuscript firmly recommends that when left cover is adopted, the fencer in third custodia should overbind his opponent's sword on the right. The manuscript then recommends the fencer in left cover move forward and wrestle his opponent. Similar problems to those discussed for Custodia 3 arise in performing a shield strike from left cover, as again there needs to be a reversal of the arms. However, a reversal of the arms is possible if time allows. Is there an attack that one can make from left cover? As with other contraria, the emphasis here is on covering, that is, defending. At a glance, we might think that the person in left cover could attempt an overbind on the right of their opponent's sword. However, this does not seem to be the priest's expectation. Instead, the priest expects his opponent to overbind his sword on the right. That is, he is conceding to his opponent an overbind on the right. He uses this overbound position to initiate a grapple, controlling his opponent's arms. This technique of offering the opponent an overbind on the right seems odd at first. However, the priest uses this procedure to move the opponent to where he wants him. Using this procedure, we must be aware that by allowing an opponent an overbind on the right, you are offering them the opportunity to conduct a shield strike and a nushin. So you must move speedily to your next movement before the opponent can complete their move. I will discuss in Chapter 4 the techniques you can use from the underbind to attack your opponent. With these techniques at our disposal, it does not seem quite so strange to offer your opponent the overbind on the right as a starting point. We will meet another example of this with falling under the sword later in this chapter where the opponent is offered an overbind on the right. The priest usually performs this falling under the sword from first custodia, an important custodia which is considered below. There is also one example in the manuscript of the priest performing this action from third custodia. So far, we have explored the Walpurgis style's attack and defense options using only 2 custodia. We will look to the other custodia in the next few chapters so that we can increase the complexity of your options and keep your opponent guessing as to your intentions. We will begin here at the beginning with the most common, most powerful, and one of the more controversial to interpret custodia, the first custodia, often called underarm. The first custodia, underarm. While the manuscript states that even the ignorant fencer uses the 7 core custodia, and implies that they are straightforward, the first custodia has been a source of disagreement between interpreters of the Walpurgis manuscript. The interpretation I offer below was one communicated to me by one of my fencing colleagues, Jason Tate, to whom I am grateful for this insight. The first custodia is the most popular one in the manuscript, occurring 16 times. It is also the custodia that the manuscript's first author used to describe the basic concepts of the style. Unfortunately, the illustrations do not show the sword hand, as it is behind the buckler in this form, and so we must make some educated guesses about it. As usual, the stance is wide and on the balls of the feet in order to facilitate a rapid entry into distance, and has a notable forward lean as you move into distance. The right hand holding the sword should be slightly in front of the left armpit. You should be holding the sword on the left side of your body at mid-chest height, with the blade pointing backwards and the long edge facing upwards. Your knuckles should be up and facing to your right. The buckler should be held with the handle vertical and in front of, and close to, the body at chest level in front of your right sword forearm. In order for a quick movement of the blade, your right elbow should project out to your right at shoulder level, and your left elbow project outwards to the left so it is about the upper middle chest height. The sword and buckler should be located centrally, that is, directly facing your opponent, which will require a slight rotation of the torso at the waist. This rather odd chicken wings stance, with the elbows out and the sword facing backwards, appears quite counterintuitive to the modern observer. However, it is in agreement with the provided illustrations and with the sequences that the manuscript describes flowing from this custodia. The first custodia is a typical custodia in that it provides little defense from attack other than as a position to initiate a bind against an opponent's cut or thrust. When bringing the sword out from this custodia, the natural clockwise motion of the sword arm as we extend it, with the sword blade passing on the outside of the buckler, is surprisingly quick and very powerful. It provides a daunting overbind on the right that is difficult to avoid or resist. I have recommended commencing first custodia with the sword's long edge up, as this provides a direct entry to the overbind on the right and is a more comfortable position to hold with the buckler and sword hilt held close to the chest and high on the torso. While we cannot see the hands in the manuscript illustrations of first custodia, there are some contemporary manuscript marginalia which show a looser version of the first custodia with the sword long edge downward. A more detailed discussion of the recognizable surviving illustrations of Walpurgis fencing style in both contemporary and later period manuscripts can be found in the final chapter of this book. Some illustrations of first custodia in the manuscript also show that when the performer has a strong forward lean, there is a tendency for the sword blade to be closer to the hip rather than held rigidly under the arm. An attack which can tempt the novice is to strike outward from first custodia towards your opponent's leading leg. The manuscript authors advise strongly against such a move. Your opponent should be keeping a forward lean, and therefore their leg should be essentially out of reach unless you get too close. By leaning forward to attack the front leg, you are exposing your head to an easy counterattack. The moral is clear. Don't cut low at your opponent from first custodia, and especially don't cut at their leg, or you are likely to be cut in the head in response. The transition from first custodia to the correct position for shield strike is very quick, smooth, and easy, making the first custodia a daunting stance for any opponent thinking of entering quickly and cutting at an apparently exposed body. The manuscript suggests that the ordinary fencer will go for the head, and you should use a shield strike. The manuscript goes on to suggest that if your opponent succeeds in countering your shield strike and steps, you should counter with a shield strike, so that he is bound up and has few attacking options. It is also very easy to move through Halbschild from first custodia, and from there to cut downwards at the right side of your opponent's body. We can also try the cut between the sword and buckler, mentioned above, but again the authors of the manuscript are dubious about the value of this approach. Having tried it myself, I find that it occasionally can be quite successful if the opponent is caught unaware. Once the sword has penetrated past the buckler, an easy thrust through Langort will generally be successful. While the overbind on the right is the most common move from the first custodia, first custodia also provides an excellent entry to the underbinds on the left and right. The first custodia provides a unique combination of excellent attacking options and swift and efficient moves to the binds. The underbind to the left is fairly unusual from the first custodia unless your opponent rapidly cuts or thrusts after stepping wide to the right. We observe that cutting attacks to the sword arm from Custodia 3 are unlikely to succeed unless your opponent is slow to begin. It is also likely to lead to your opponent successfully with an overbind on the right. The same is true for Custodia 1. Also, if you do decide to attempt to cut, to the opponent's sword arm, you will have to remember to cross your wrists, as otherwise your sword arm is very exposed to a cut from your opponent. While the primary thrusting option from First Custodia is the shield strike, a simple thrust through Langort with perhaps a small step to the right on entry to distance can be effective if well timed. You can see why, with this wide range of attacking defensive options from Custodia 1, is the most frequent beginning Custodia in the manuscript, and one you will wish to practice frequently. You will find the First Custodia is almost the default beginning Custodia, and one that will serve you well. A Contraria designed to meet Custodia 1. This Contraria, recommended by the manuscript as the specific counter to First Custodia, is our old friend, the Hapschild. This combination is a very common opposition and starting point for a bout. The manuscript provides a specific attack on Hapschild from First Custodia. The manuscript authors seem to think their description of this move is obvious. However, their limited explanation has proven difficult to understand for modern interpreters of this manuscript. One of the best clues we have to understanding this important attacking move is its name, falling under the sword and buckler. Falling under the sword and buckler. When falling under the sword, the combatant in First Custodia swings his blade up to contact the flat of his opponent's blade, who is standing in Hapschild. In the first edition of this manual, this was interpreted as an attempted overbind on the right. Further examination makes it clear that this cannot be the manuscript's intended meaning. No matter how hard you might swing the blade up from First Custodia, it is not possible to significantly move the opponent's two arms pressed together in Hapschild. Many attempts by the author produce no significant sword displacement, though many sparks. Re-examining the illustrations in the manuscript show that the person performing falling under the sword strikes his opponent's blade at its base with the tip of his sword. This makes it mechanically impossible for the falling under the sword action to result in an overbind for the performer of this action. Every example of falling under the sword in the manuscript shows the performer being overbound by his opponent. It is clear that falling under the sword, as the name suggests, is an action designed to cause the opponent to perform an overbind on the right, so that the performer's sword is underneath his opponent's sword and buckler, literally falling under the sword. This means, of course, that we have surprisingly conceded to our opponent an overbind on the right and offered them the opportunity for a shield strike and a Nushin. The deliberate offering of an overbind on the right implies that we have the potential to thwart the shield strike and Nushin. We have seen previously that we can move from being overbound to the underbind, in this case an underbind on the left. The manuscript offers these suggestions when the priest is overbound from falling under the sword. The priest, on the other hand, has three things he can do, namely to change his sword, so that he will be above, or to step through, or to use his right hand to grab the student's arms, like his sword and shield. By immediately responding to your opponent's overbind with your mutation, using the force of your opponent's overbind to rotate your sword anti-clockwise, you have quickly moved from being underbound to an overbind on the left of their sword. It is more difficult to understand here what is meant by the stepping through, as it would seem difficult to move from the underbind on the left to a cutting attack on the upper torso of your opponent. While this move is possible, it would appear to be too slow and expose the performer through much of the action. A shield strike may help provide the time for this movement. Could the term stepping through have a broader application? The manuscript does indicate this possibility in other contexts of rotating the blade from under the overbind and cutting or thrusting through your opponent's extended arms or attacking the lower body. If this action involved a simple half step or step forward to the right combined with a cutting or thrusting action under your opponent's arms, then it might also have been considered a form of stepping around, under and through your opponent's guard. We will meet the third alternative, a grapple or wrestling move, in Chapter 6, where it shall be described in detail. Of the 5 illustrations of falling under the sword, in the manuscript only 2 display a successful outcome for the performer. In the first successful instance, the performer quickly shield strikes his opponent from the underbind on the left, and then performs a nushin. In the second instance, the priest who is underbound performs a shield strike as part of cutting the arms. See a discussion of this move in Chapter 4. Of the other 3 examples, 2 result in the opponent succeeding with his shield strike and nushin, while the third does not show a conclusion to the sequence. This is all a little surprising, as the success rate of this regularly recommended action of falling under the sword appears to be fairly poor. I have already noted a little earlier that this falling under the sword can be done against Custodia 3 as well, which, like Custodia 1, lends itself to the overbind on the right. The manuscript even has a short verse which it repeats, recommending the use of falling under the sword when facing Hauptschild. When the Hauptschild is adopted, fall under the sword and shield. I will explore attacks from the underbind on the left in more detail in Chapter 4. I am indebted to my fencing colleague for this surprising but much improved and revised interpretation of falling under the sword. There is one more move from the versatile First Custodia that we need to examine before concluding this chapter: blade grasping. Blade grasping from First Custodia. The manuscript offers another option. If your opponent in Langort moves suddenly into distance with a straight thrust, then rather than over or underbinding, you can blade grasp. While out of distance from First Custodia, you can take both the buckler and the sword in your left hand, holding the sword by the blade. This is possible because in First Custodia the hands are hidden behind the buckler and are next to each other. It takes only a small movement to grasp both sword and buckler in the left hand. Meanwhile, the right hand grasps the approaching sword tip, pulling it offline and pulling the attacker off balance. Unfortunately, in this position your sword is not readily available to thrust at the now off-balance opponent, and a successful end to the sequence is not shown in the manuscript. We might speculate that a thrust downward with the sword on the left hand, while the opponent is pulled off balance, might be well effective. The manuscript does provide a counter to this move. If the person whose sword has been grasped moves forward rapidly with their buckler, they can strike the opponent's right hand, which is holding their sword blade, with their buckler edge, causing them to release the grip on the sword. While this move is of historical interest, using the edge of the buckler against an opponent's hand is likely to cause significant injuries and would be inappropriate in a sporting context. While people worry that with a sharp sword the hand might be cut while blade grasping, this is relatively easily avoided. If you grasp firmly with the thumb on one side of the blade and the side of the fingers on the other side, you can get a grip which is almost as strong as your opponent's grip on their sword handle. With a little practice, it is easy to avoid contact with the blade edge while blade grasping a thrust, meaning that this would be a viable technique when using a sharp sword and would not have likely cut into your hand. And that's the conclusion of this chapter.